The Guardian is reporting on a heartbreaking story coming out of Syria. They say U.S. airstrikes on a Syrian village have killed at least 73 civilians, a majority of them women and children, activists say, in the deadliest coalition attack on non-combatants since the start of the bombing campaign against ISIS. The bombing was part of a 2-month push to seize the town of Manbij, a strategic center key to any further advance on ISIS's de facto capital, Raqqa. Activists had warned of high civilian casualty rates from airstrikes in Manbij even before the latest airstrike. So in total, 117 people died, but they're saying at least 73 civilians, most of those civilians, women and children. According to one count, it was 85 people who were killed, which would mean that that's actually the same number as the people who died in the terror attack in Nice, France. And this is an interesting / disastrous little case study of how we react to violence depending on who does the violence. But is there as much coverage, equal coverage, in the ballpark of the same amount of coverage for what happened in Nice, France versus Western bombing, U.S. bombing that killed about the same number of civilians? That's just not the case. I mean, you got to call it what it is. Now, here's usually where people trot out this point about intent. They say, okay, yeah, but the main difference is the whole point of what that guy did is to kill civilians. For us, that wasn't the point. So it was an accident. Now, that's a fair enough point, but I often find that when people make it, they're making it in service of flat out downplaying our violence when we do it. And I do not agree with those ends. That's not like, to make that point is fine if you're making that point as a rational human being and you're still obviously super torn up and distraught about the fact that we just killed about the same number of civilians that died in the Nice, France attack. But oftentimes when people make that point, it's honestly to shut down all conversation about the violence when the violence is carried out by the West and by the U.S. And also there's another counter-argument to that, which I find super compelling. It's something that came to my mind a while ago when I was thinking about these issues, which is, okay, so what they're talking about is the difference between murder and manslaughter. So with murder, with certain degrees of murder, okay, the whole point was to kill the innocent person, so therefore that person is more morally culpable than somebody who does manslaughter. Manslaughter, of course, being, well, I didn't mean to kill the person, but I killed the person. So that's a different level of ethical and moral responsibility. Now, up to this point, just describing the difference, that's true, and I don't think anybody can disagree with it. But here's where you run into a problem when talking about Western violence versus, what you could argue is terroristic violence on the other side. Imagine you have an individual who, is driving and they end up hitting and killing a poor woman crossing the street, and now that woman's dead. They're brought up on manslaughter charges, and they go through the proceedings. Now, we'd all say, oh my God, a tragic disaster, but if indeed it's proven that he didn't want to kill the person, it was a mistake, well, then everybody's in favor of a lower sentence than somebody who committed murder, obviously. Take that scenario now, though, and extrapolate it times infinity. So you have a guy who goes out of his house every other day, or once a week, let's say. And whoops! I just happened yet again to kill 8 civilians with my vehicle. But every single time he turns around and makes the argument, no, it was a mistake. Now, I know I did this last Wednesday, and I did it today, and I'm going to do it next Wednesday and the Wednesday after that. But I'm telling you, my intentions are so pure. My intentions are so overwhelmingly good, and it was just such a mistake that What are you going to do? You can't hold me morally accountable in the same way that you're holding the person who committed one murder accountable. Well, then at that point I go, fuck your intentions. Because if you say you have pure intentions, but you keep making the same mistake and the same consequences are dead civilians, well, how many times before I learned and I say, maybe your consequences really aren't that pure. Maybe after the third manslaughter, I go, wow, there's a pattern of manslaughter here. Maybe at the very least, they are beyond criminally negligent for it. You understand the point that I'm trying to make here? So, to bring in more evidence, I mean, look at, for example, the drone death rate. So, the drone program has a 90% civilian death rate. Understand, that's not me saying it, that's not Code Pink saying it, that's internal drone memos inside the government saying it, and it was released recently. Now, go to talk to former drone operators, and what do they tell you? Dude, you have no idea. They say, when you're in that environment and in that culture, first of all, a lot of them are hopped up on cocaine, a lot of them are drunk. That's how people are acting as they're operating these drones. And they've described people as fun-sized terrorists. When they kill children, they're like, it's all right, it was a terrorist in training, fun-sized terrorist. It's fine, no problem, don't worry about it. So 90% civilian death rate. So the picture I'm trying to paint for you is not that Western violence and U.S. violence is what we all thought it was growing up, in the sense that we go, well, I mean, obviously there's like multiple layers of, of a process to try to ascertain guilt or innocence, who the right targets are, get all the right intelligence, and be super precise. And oh my God, there's a room full of Taliban operatives, but there's also one innocent toddler in there, so we can't do the strike. That ain't what Western violence is, man. That's not what U.S. violence is. It's more like, hey, there's one Taliban guy in a room with 8 other innocent civilians, the majority of them women and children. Press the button anyway. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is not simply collateral damage. Collateral damage, when I hear that, my thoughts are, oh, so you just mean we thought we were only getting a Taliban guy or an Al-Qaeda guy. We went through all the proper processes. We were 100% sure that's the guy. And then we went to go kill the guy. And oh my God, at the last second, it turns out there was a civilian there. And we didn't know. We're so sorry. We would have never launched if that was the case. That's what I think of when I think of collateral damage. But that's not what we're doing. What we're doing is we're playing loose with innocent civilians to the point where, like I just described, if we think we could get one bad guy and 8 innocent people have to die, or 30 innocent people have to die, the people making that decision oftentimes go, fuck it. They don't count as much as Western lives anyway. They don't. What are you going to do? They're fucking random Pakistani people. I don't give a fuck. This is the kind of thinking. So there needs to be loud, aggressive moral condemnation of it, because the violence and the deaths of civilians that we cause has become so normalized that it's always just dismissed as, what are you going to do? Was a mistake. And the most important point, how many more jihadists were created as a result of this? Now, don't get me wrong. There's multiple components to becoming a jihadist, and each case is different. So, for example, some might just be brainwashed from when they're young, and it's purely fundamentalist Islam that drove them to do what they did, and they didn't have any claim of victimhood. That's one example. Sometimes it's a mix of victimhood and the ideology. And other times, keep it real, it's just pure revenge and vengeance. And I'm going to join with these guys because at least these guys are going to fight back against the motherfuckers that killed my aunt and uncle. Sometimes that's what it is. And we just created probably hundreds of those kinds of people who are now going to fight against the West. And then we'll turn around and go, oh, we never did anything to deserve this. You're right. Nobody ever deserves it, ever. Nobody ever deserves to get their innocent civilians killed. But we have to stop the cycle of violence and the cycle of radicalization. So let's stop killing their civilians. They should stop killing our civilians. And then let's try to get to a more amicable and agreeable future where there's less bloodshed across the board. And this happens at the same time that the Republicans at their convention were just arguing for loosening the rules of engagement. They were just arguing for that. Oh, rules of engagement are too tough. Oh, look at that. We killed over 70 innocent civilians, mostly women and children, in the same week they were arguing to loosen the rules of engagement. No. We all need to abide by the Geneva Conventions. We all need to abide by rule of law. Do we actually believe in our values, or do we just proclaim to believe in our values and then behind the scenes act in a very barbaric and savage way? I don't know about you guys, but I actually believe in liberal values. I don't just use it as a talking point. I believe in it because I think they're true and I think they're right, and I think you only hold the moral high ground when you act in accordance with liberal values and human rights and secularism and altruism. So I do not excuse this. I do not just say, oh, whatever, we meant well, so nobody fucking talk about it, and don't you dare say that we're akin to our enemies in any way. Terrorism is defined as violence for a political or religious reason. Well, is this violence for a political reason? You bet your fucking ass it is. So don't be an apologist for our violence. But don't be an apologist for their violence either. All of the violence against innocent civilians is wrong. But we need to muster up the same kind of moral outrage in both cases. And by the way, in this one, we are more responsible because it's our government doing it in our name with our money. So we have the ability to fight back to try to stop the killing of innocent civilians by electing the right people, changing the wrong policies, and holding people accountable. So that's what we need to fight for. We can't just sit there and say, well, we didn't mean it, so everybody shut the fuck up. No, that's how a dumb, ignorant person responds.